Okay, welcome back. And today we are going to start with fiscal policy. But before I start with the details of fiscal policy and the fiscal policy tools, I want you to understand two very important concepts, which will come in very handy in this chapter. And this is to do with inflationary and deflationary gaps. Okay, so inflationary and deflationary gaps are very important in the study of and especially in the keynesian study, because this is how he explains the Keynes explains the disequilibriums and why inflation is caused, and why there are problems in the economy, and then how the government can correct these problems. So let us very quickly go to inflationary gap. What is inflationary gap? When we talk about the inflationary gap, we are talking about a situation. If you look at the graph, we are talking about the situation where the aggregate demand in the economy exceeds the aggregate value of the output. Okay, now if it the situation would have been that if aggregate demand went up and the output increased to meet that increased aggregate demand, then there would have been no problem in the economy. But the problem is that that does not happen all the time. Okay, that is not something that is going to happen, that whenever aggregate demand increases, the aggregate supply or the output will increase also. Why does that happen? That happens because when you reach the point of full employment, at that point it is not possible to increase output any further. So that is a very important assumption, and that is a very important ingredient in the study of the inflationary gap. The main thing is that when the economy is at full employment, and at that point the aggregate demand goes up, I'm going to show this by an example. At that point the aggregate demand goes up, then there has to be inflation, because you cannot increase the output to meet the increase in aggregate demand. Now, if you look at this graph, it shows the situation perfectly. The Initially the economy is producing. By the way, this is the 45-degree line, and you know what the 45-degree line is. It divides this quadrant into two equal parts. So along this 45-degree line, the national output and the aggregate expenditure will be equal. I want you to look at this graph very carefully and look at the y-axis. On the y-axis, you do not have price. That's a different diagram. In this diagram, we have aggregate expenditure or the aggregate demand, which becomes equal to aggregate expenditure, also equal to national output. But we are now segregating this. We are segregating this. On the y-axis, we are keeping aggregate expenditure, and on the x-axis, we are keeping the output, the GDP. On the y-axis, we do not have price. Please do keep in mind in this diagram. So here the aggregate demand curve doesn't slope downward like it usually does in the when we are plotting price against quantity demanded. Here aggregate expenditure is being plotted against the national output. Okay, so here you will see, don't get confused that why is the aggregate demand curve sloping upward. It's sloping upward because we do not have price on the y-axis. When we place price on the y-axis, it'll again start sloping downward. But look at it very carefully. On all points above the 45-degree line, the aggregate expenditure will be higher and the national output will be lesser. And below the 45-degree line, the national output will be higher and the aggregate expenditure will be lesser. But throughout this line, the aggregate expenditure is equal to national output. Thus, the economy is in equilibrium and there is no inflation. There is no inflation because the output is exactly matched by the expenditure in the economy. However, if now the aggregate demand goes up, okay, for whatever reason, the aggregate demand goes up. The main thing is that the economy cannot increase the output. The supply cannot increase because at YF, okay, this is YF. If it's not very clear, I'll point to this. This is YF. There is, we are operating at point A. Okay, at point A, everything is fully employed. So there is no problem here. Whatever is being produced is being matched by the aggregate expenditure. But when the aggregate demand goes up, okay, when the aggregate demand goes up, what happens? We cannot increase the supply. So when we cannot increase the supply, we should increase the supply to Y star. Look at this, Y star. But I've kept it Y star because, sorry, we cannot reach this level of output. The level of output will be fixed here. Okay, the level of output is fixed here. This is a vertical straight line. This is full employment, and the aggregate demand suddenly rises to point B. So the difference between these two is the inflationary gap. Why is it the inflationary gap? Because now only prices can increase, output cannot increase. When there is more money chasing less goods, only prices go up. Okay, so this is the inflationary gap. The example has been given here. I cannot go into this in detail, but I've said that if the value of the output is 600 million and the government takes away 100 million in withdrawals or taxes, all right, then 500 million and 500 million in, sorry, this is not crore, this is million. 500 million is left in expenditure, and 500 million is the output. Both are equal, so the income and the output become equal. But now let's say if for whatever reason the money income rises to 900 million, okay, the money income rises, so aggregate demand will go up, people have more money, aggregate demand goes up, but the economy cannot increase the output. The economy cannot increase the output. So what will happen? Out of that 900 million, 500 million is the output, national output. 100 million the government takes in additional tax, and 100 million people keep in savings. That still leaves 200 million of extra cash, of extra money in the economy. This 200 million represents the inflationary gap. This is going to pull the prices of the products up. Output will not increase, only the prices will go up. Now we will show the same inflationary gap. We will change the factor on the y-axis. Now we are going to show it against price. Now we are going to plot the output against price. So when we plot the output against price, what happens? Now the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. What happens? AD1 and SRAS1. Look at these two. This is the initial point where the two are intersecting. Okay, this and this is the initial point where these two are intersecting, and this is the this is the price. Okay, this is the price when there is full when where there is full employment. We also have the vertical line showing the full employment. So here the economy is in balance, everything is in balance, but suddenly the aggregate demand goes up. When the aggregate demand goes up from 81 to 82, what happens? There is going to be inflation in the economy. Prices will only rise. Why will prices rise? Uh, because we cannot increase the output beyond this purple line, the long run, the long run aggregate supply, because the long run aggregate supply is fixed at this point in time, this point of output. So now the difference between 81, look at this, the difference between 81 and 82, the difference between YP and Y2, this shows the inflationary situation. It's just going to lead to an increase in prices. And the supply will once again adjust. There will be an adjustment. Okay, this is the new aggregate demand curve. So the supply curve will also move backward to come back to the long run uh, average supply situation, to the fixed output situation. We will have to come back to an equilibrium on this long run average supply. So what happens? Demand increases. Because of that, we cannot increase the output, and the supply has to shrink to adjust the economy, to bring it back into balance. What is the result? The overall result is a massive increase in prices because of two situations. Because the uh, one, because the aggregate demand has increased and we cannot increase the supply to keep up with the aggregate demand. And secondly, we will have to reduce the supply to bring the economy back into the equilibrium where the intersection takes place between aggregate demand, short run average supply, and the long run average supply curve. So that can only happen at point B3, where a massive increase in inflation takes place. Okay, so this is as far as the inflationary gap is concerned. Okay, please do keep in mind that the inflationary gap has to be shown via both diagrams. You will have to show it using the 45-degree line, national output on the x-axis, aggregate expenditure on the y-axis, and you will also have to show it using the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve with the price on the y-axis with the adjustment. So please make sure that you understand both these diagrams very carefully. In the next video, I am going to briefly talk about the deflationary gap, and then we will start the fiscal policy in earnest. Okay, thank you very much, and stay tuned for more videos.